The gates swing open. A man, stripped to a loincloth, squints into a sun that seems to glare with the approval of tens of thousands. The sand beneath him is already a map of past violence, darkened, compacted, stained. From the opposite gate, a great cat explodes into the arena, muscles rippling, teeth bared, eyes fixed on the only living thing between it and the Emperor's box. The leader of the crowd raises his hand. The hand falls. The show begins. If you think of Roman justice as solemn tribunals and austere magistrates, you're only half right. For most Romans, punishment was also theater. It was civic ritual, statecraft, religion, and entertainment braided into one. The poet who scoffed that the people wanted bread and circuses wasn't merely lamenting hunger for cheap pleasures. He was diagnosing a civic appetite for public bloodshed. The execution wasn't abstract punishment. It was a communal spectacle that affirmed power, piety, and order. Emperors, magistrates, and organizers treated these moments like festival programming. Certain days were set aside for games, ludi, that could include animal hunts, theatrical fights, and executions staged with dramatic flourish. Some emperors expanded the calendar until spectacle filled much of the year, arranging mornings for lighter diversions, high noon for the grisly set pieces, and afternoons for gladiatorial combat. The theater of death was, crucially, a full-day production. No venue suited the choreography of killing better than the Colosseum. Built to hold tens of thousands, its floor disguised an entire industrial theater below. Cages, hoists, trapdoors, and winding corridors where animals and condemned men waited in darkness for a cue. When the subterranean machinery released a tiger or a bear into the light, the transition felt like magic or sacrament. Contemporary accounts suggest the inaugural games alone slaughtered thousands of beasts and uncounted human victims, staged as hunts, mythic reenactments, and tableaus of cruelty. And what better way to dramatize a killing than to turn it into a story? Condemned men were costumed as mythic figures. Icarus hurled from a height, Orpheus sent into the arena with a lyre that could not save him. The effect was a ghastly parody, familiar myth rewritten as instant public death sentences. Nero delighted in these inventions, arranging scenes designed to shock his guests, sometimes sending doomed participants on grotesque pantomimes that ended in theatrical bloodshed. The spectacle bent ancient tale into live horror. Behind the grandeur lay an empire-spanning apparatus. Specialized hunters, venatores, scoured forests, deserts, and islands to supply exotic creatures. Celebrations for military victories could turn into weeks or months of games in which thousands of animals and prisoners were paraded and slaughtered. The size of these events staggered the imagination. Herds of ostriches, packs of stags, waves of beasts released to chase and maul the unfortunate humans trapped behind spears and nets. These weren't random killings, they were carefully composed seasonal productions, the ancient equivalent of blockbuster cinema, only bloodier. For ordinary Romans, attending these spectacles was at once religious duty, civic participation, and the most vivid form of news. The arena taught lessons. This is what happens to traitors, to thieves, to those who offend the gods, to criminals who break the social order. Theories of justice, retributive, ceremonial, and didactic all converged into public death. Yet not all executions were solitary. Some punishments were devised specifically to terrify onlookers and to valorize the state. The condemned might be burned, torn by beasts, crushed, or sewn into devices that denied them the very elements of life. Fire, water, animals, and engineered machinery were all tools in a repertoire meant to amplify humiliation as much as it ended a life. In Rome, the line between law and performance blurred. Punishment became pedagogy delivered in the most visceral terms possible. And the message reached across social strata. Soldiers who deserted or cowardly commanders found themselves facing ritualized collective punishments overseen by their peers. Political traitors, religious offenders, slaves, and captives all learned, often too late, that the empire could turn legal sanction into theatrical annihilation. This was not mere revenge, it was an act of communication. The spectacle taught everyone who watched how the state wanted its story told. But if spectacle was language, then cruelty was its grammar. The spectacle satisfied a complicated hunger, for justice certainly, but also for the sublime feeling of participating in a vast, ordered ritual. The moment you stood in the amphitheater and watched a man vanish beneath a beast's claws, the city's hierarchies, gods, and laws pulsed into life. That is the unsettling genius of Roman punishment. It converted death into civic drama, and drama into a currency of power. When we move beyond the Colosseum's trapdoors, the variety of Roman punishments becomes dizzying and revealing. Fire could be both a purifier and a spectacle. Some crimes were thought to pollute the civic body in a way that only flames could cleanse. Arsonists, certain religious offenders, and those accused of ritual impurity could be roasted or immolated in public. During one notorious period after Rome's Great Fire, Christians were ripped from their cells and forced to burn as grotesque torches to light an emperor's gardens at night. The sick aesthetic of illumination, human bonfires staged as evening entertainment, shocked even a populace accustomed to public brutality. The military too staged its own brand of theatrical justice. Frustuarium, execution by clubs, was meted out when discipline collapsed. A disgraced soldier might be led before his comrades and struck down by the very hands that once fought beside him. The punishment was both corrective and performative. It restored order by making the penitential violence communal. Sometimes entire cohorts faced collective penalties, the most infamous being decimation, the methodical, lottery-driven slaughter where 1 in 10 men was killed by his fellows. The calculus was brutal, but effective. Compel loyalty by making comrades complicit in execution. If clubs and fire satisfied the need for spectacle and discipline, crushing delivered a different message: obliteration. To be ground beneath stones, or, in the more exotic cases, under the feet of trained elephants, was to be reduced not simply to death, but to dust. These punishments denied proper burial, ensured nothing remained to honor the dead, and thereby struck at social memory itself. Romans obsessed over remembrance. Denying that was a punishment as severe as any physical torment. Crucifixion occupied a special place among Roman penalties, reserved for the lowest and most dangerous offenders, slaves, pirates, insurrectionists. It combined humiliation with slow public mortality. Victims were stripped, flogged, forced to carry their own crossbeams, and left to die through exposure, thirst, and asphyxiation. Methods were invented to lengthen this agony: little seats anchored to the beams, straps, or positions that kept the condemned alive for days. The sight of crucified bodies lining the main roads was a deliberate civic statement. Dare rebel, and this will be your legacy. Yet some punishments were not designed only to terrify the living. They struck at the very idea of personhood. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts, turned execution into a theatrical hunt. Sometimes the condemned were dressed as mythic characters, a man costumed as Hercules, dragged before a lion, or an Icarus fitted with makeshift wings and made to fall. This macabre pageantry combined cultural reference with physical destruction, creating a performance that both amused and instructed. The lined-up bodies, the roar of the crowd, the emperor's nod, all affirm the state's narrative about crime, myth, and order. Equally symbolic were punishments aimed at obliterating memory. Damnatio memoriae, the sentence that tried to erase a person from history, struck at what Romans treasured most: legacy. Statues were toppled or recarved, names chiseled from inscriptions, coins melted down.
The state attempted to unmake someone's presence in the public record, cutting them off from posterity. Ironically, the more thorough the erasure, the more historians and archaeologists have later noticed the gaps, piecing together vanished lives from the scars left on stone. The attempt to remove memory often ensures its survival in absence. Some punishments targeted the sacred bond between child and parent. Parricide, the murder of a parent, demanded a punishment that mirrored the moral horror. The condemned could be beaten, sewn into a sack with living animals, dog, rooster, monkey, serpent, and drowned. The grotesque menagerie inside the sack symbolized the unnatural, animalistic betrayal of family ties. The ritual sought to ensure the criminal was denied the elemental comforts of earth, sky, and sun, and exiled from both community and cosmos. And then there were punishments imported, adapted, and perfected for maximum horror. Scaphism, a kind of slow, rotting execution involving entombment between hollowed vessels and being left to drown in filth and insects, exemplified the Roman willingness to incorporate foreign tortures into their repertoire when the goal was protracted suffering. The brazen bull and other methods of slow roasting did similar work, transformed death into an extended spectacle, a lesson carved into flesh for all to witness. Live burial, used in cases where direct killing of sacred individuals was forbidden by superstition or law, worked as legal theater. Vestal virgins who breached their vows, deemed pollutering of Rome's sacred fire, were not openly executed. Instead, they were provisioned, lowered into small underground chambers, and abandoned. The state could claim it did not spill sacred blood while still ensuring the woman perished, a juridical loophole wrapped in ritual propriety. What unites all these punishments is symbolism. The method chosen often mirrored the crime's supposed moral nature. Sacrilege meant fire, betrayal meant oblivion, familial murder meant animalized burial. Roman jurists and moralists argued that penalties should reflect the essence of the offense. That logic produced some of the most inventive and horrifying methods of human destruction ever conceived. And yet, even amid the theater of cruelty, unexpected human reactions complicated the script. There were moments when an elephant refused to trample its former keeper, when a crowd's pity overtook appetite for spectacle, when a condemned voice preserved dignity in the face of smoke and flame. Even emperors occasionally found their appetite for pageantry checked by the sight of suffering too plainly aimed at satisfying personal vengeance rather than public justice. So where does that leave us? With a civilization capable of engineering aqueducts and law codes that also staged human annihilation as a civic event. Rome's penal imagination was as architectural as its buildings, carefully constructed, theatrically articulated, and devastatingly effective at sending messages. Power, memory, and punishment braided together, leaving visible scars across the city and the historical record. But we have only begun to unearth the full logic and legacy of these practices. In the next section, we'll trace how these punishments evolved with Rome's politics, how emperors used them to buy loyalty, how legal reforms reshaped cruelty, and how memory stubbornly resisted erasure. You'll see how private cruelty became public policy, and how the stories of martyrs, traitors, and common soldiers reveal the deepest anxieties of an empire. Continue, and the empire's darkest lessons come into sharper focus.
As the republic faded and emperors replaced senators as the center of gravity, punishment itself transformed. What had once been a civic ritual now became a mirror of imperial psychology. Death ceased to be merely instructive, it became personal. In the early empire, Augustus built his reputation on restoring moral order. He spoke of virtue, family, and piety, yet under his reign, public executions multiplied. He understood something vital. Punishment was propaganda. A well-timed spectacle could erase dissent more effectively than decrees. When Augustus declared certain crimes like treason, adultery, or sacrilege heinous enough to deserve public death, it wasn't just about justice.
It was about staging morality for mass consumption. Every emperor after him learned the lesson. Nero wielded execution like theater direction, turning punishment into performance art. His reign blurred every boundary between justice, vanity, and madness. In his gardens, victims burned as human candles, lighting the night while Nero paraded among them as both god and audience. The message was unmistakable. Rome's ruler didn't just command armies, he commanded suffering itself. Even the philosopher Seneca, Nero's reluctant tutor, found himself caught in this paradox. He despised the arena, but admitted its magnetism. I come home more greedy, more ambitious, more cruel. He recognized in himself what Rome embodied, a civilization addicted to its own spectacle of pain. And how could it not be? Executions were not isolated punishments, but orchestrated civic events. Attendance wasn't optional. It was participation in Rome's grand narrative. The state understood this power. Executions became the empire's moral theater, the most efficient sermon on loyalty and obedience. Gladiators bled for honor. Criminals died for law. And traitors died for memory. Crucifixion, damnatio ad bestias, burning, and live burial all became instruments in the empire's repertoire of control. But treason demanded something more symbolic, punishments that struck beyond the body, targeting the soul, the legacy, the very idea of personhood. Treason wasn't seen as an offense against an emperor, but against Rome itself, against civilization. That's why traitors didn't just die, they were unmade. The Tarpeian Rock, a sheer cliff overlooking the Roman Forum, was one of the earliest stages for this moral theater. Here, condemned traitors were hurled into the void as spectators watched their bodies shatter against the rocks below. The choice of location was no accident. The traitor's fall happened within sight of the temples and senate halls he had betrayed. The symbolism was exquisite. Ambition dashed against the foundations of Rome itself. From the Republic through the Empire, that symbolism deepened. To betray Rome was to be erased from it, physically, historically, spiritually. And if erasure failed, obliteration followed. Consider damnatio memoriae, damnation of memory. This punishment was reserved for emperors, senators, and generals who fell from grace. Their names were chiseled from inscriptions, their statues decapitated or refaced, their likenesses smeared out of frescoes. Sculptors even began crafting interchangeable heads for imperial statues just in case a future purge required a quick substitution. Erasure became bureaucratized. Memory itself became a state-managed resource. Domitian, after his assassination, was subjected to this ultimate obliteration. His monuments were defaced, his name removed from triumphal arches, his portraits systematically destroyed. Yet, ironically, that destruction ensured his immortality. The missing inscriptions and broken reliefs still whisper his name through absence. For the Romans, fear was not a flaw of governance, it was a pillar of it. Punishment fed politics, and politics fed punishment. The public learned obedience through terror, and emperors measured their majesty by the number of spectacles they could afford to stage. During Emperor Trajan's reign, the games celebrating his Dacian victories lasted 123 days. An orgy of death involving over 11,000 animals and countless condemned souls. It wasn't only to honor his triumph, it was to remind the people that Rome's prosperity was written in blood. But the most chilling punishments were not public. They were intimate. Inside prisons and private courtyards, victims endured the tortures Rome preferred to keep behind walls. The rack, the hooks, the slow slicing of flesh. These punishments weren't just retribution. They were interrogation devices, tools of extraction, instruments designed to dissolve both truth and humanity. The torturer's goal was simple: to make the condemned confess, not necessarily to guilt, but to submission. Seneca once warned that cruelty corrodes the soul of the ruler who uses it, but every emperor found his own threshold for brutality. Commodus fought in the arena himself, killing prisoners while dressed as Hercules. Caligula executed nobles for amusement. Caracalla ordered mass slaughter in Alexandria after an insult. Each believed cruelty confirmed divine right. And yet, within this empire of terror, small acts of mercy occasionally pierced the darkness. Claudius once pardoned a man spared by an elephant's compassion. Crowds erupted in applause, moved by the beast's refusal to kill. The emperor relented, letting the man live. It was a flicker of humanity in a world engineered to extinguish it. The Roman Empire built roads, aqueducts, and legal systems that endured millennia, yet those same stones witnessed spectacles of such horror that even ancient writers struggled to describe them. Their punishments were not random. They were structured performances in a civilization obsessed with power, permanence, and spectacle. The empire's cruelty wasn't an accident of its time. It was part of its architecture. And as Rome reached its zenith, its punishments reached their peak, more sophisticated, more symbolic, more sadistic. What had begun as civic ceremony evolved into imperial theater, and the entire empire became its audience. But how did it end? What finally broke the chain between punishment and pleasure, between empire and cruelty? To answer that, we must enter the twilight of Rome, the centuries when blood no longer bought loyalty, when mercy began to challenge power, and when the memory of cruelty became the empire's own curse. The answers lie in the empire's slow collapse and in the strange persistence of its shadows that reach us even now.
As Rome decayed from within, the grand machinery of execution began to grind to a halt. Not because the empire lost its appetite for power, but because it began to lose control of the narrative. By the 4th century CE, Christianity had spread from secret catacombs to the emperor's palace. A faith that preached redemption, forgiveness, and sanctity of life began to erode the moral foundations of Rome's spectacles. The same arenas that had once echoed with cheers now became sites of martyrdom, and paradoxically, of transformation. The empire's instruments of terror forged its own undoing. When Christians were thrown to beasts, burned alive, or crucified, their composure and suffering turned the empire's script upside down. Where Romans saw shame, the new faith saw glory. Where the crowd expected despair, it found defiance. These victims refused to die quietly. They sang, they prayed, they forgave. The state's most potent tool, public death, began producing sympathy instead of obedience. Tertullian, one of the earliest Christian writers, famously declared, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." He wasn't exaggerating. Every spectacle meant to terrify the masses instead converted them. The amphitheater that once affirmed Rome's gods began, slowly, to honor another. By the time Constantine legalized Christianity, the very instruments once used to destroy it had become secret symbols. The cross, Rome's emblem of humiliation, was transformed into a sign of salvation. The Colosseum itself, once the empire's altar of death, fell silent, its arches crumbling into monuments of collective guilt. The empire had turned on its own reflection and could not bear the sight. But the end of spectacle didn't erase the instinct behind it.
Rome's philosophy of punishment, that fear maintains order, that justice must be seen, outlived the empire. Medieval Europe inherited its pageantry of execution, burnings, hangings, public tortures. The shadow of the amphitheater lingered across centuries. Even in modern times, traces of Rome's spectacle survive. The obsession with justice as entertainment, the lure of violence as public ritual, the fascination with power over life and death all echo that ancient stage. Every courtroom that demands public apology, every media frenzy over punishment, carries a faint whisper of the Colosseum's roar. Rome's cruelty was not senseless. It was precise, codified, and deeply human. A mirror held up to our oldest instincts: dominance, fear, spectacle, and memory. Its punishments were designed to last beyond death, and they did. Seneca once warned that he who delights in cruelty becomes its servant. In the end, Rome became a servant to its own spectacle. The empire that once mastered the art of killing found itself killed not by barbarians or famine, but by the moral exhaustion of its own brilliance. Its walls crumbled, its fires went cold, but its lessons remained, carved in marble, whispered in ruins, remembered in silence. Because Rome was not merely a civilization, it was a performance. And like all great performances, it ended not by a battle, but by an echo. The echo of chains, the echo of a crowd's cheer fading into the wind, the echo of a dying empire still trying to convince itself that cruelty was justice. And as history shows us, that echo has never fully died.